All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to go over some of the articles that I've published on GovCon Intelligence over the past week, including an article on size standards that SBA proposed 2 Fridays ago, as well as something I published over the weekend, just before the long weekend, about interesting strategy that GSA's Polaris contract is making with respect to SBA size protests, some proposed cuts to SBA's rules, and the big inflation adjustments that came out from the FAR and the DFARs. So first with the size standards. SBA published 2 Fridays ago this humongous size standards proposed rule. It's probably the largest size standards rule the agency has ever published, perhaps even the largest proposed rule ever of any type that the agency has published. It's over 100 Federal Register pages, and there are lots of tables in the Federal Register for this publication. The tables, unfortunately, are not searchable. So I went ahead and made the main table, which is the table with the proposed size standards and the existing size standards, available in a Google Sheet. You can go to govconintelligence.com, look for the size standards proposed rule, and look at that Google Sheet if you want to search through the size standards and see what SBA proposed. The size standards, in this case, are the numeric revenue-based values. About half of the SBA size standards of the 1,000 or so are those revenue-based values, and the other half are employee-based standards. And SBA this time decided to just split those into two separate rulemakings. The first one that's coming out are these revenue-based size standards. That's about 513 of them. The other half or so will be published probably in the next 6 months or so, and those will be the employee-based size standards. Of these 513, SBA proposed to increase 259 of them, and there was an interesting decision in the proposed rule to say that had SBA just followed economic analysis based on the data that SBA collects from the census and federal procurement data, SBA would have lowered 213 size standards. But SBA proposed not to lower those size standards. SBA said that if it were to lower those size standards, about 7,800 current small businesses would lose their status, and that would result in fewer set-asides. The agencies not meeting their small business procurement goals, supply chains would be impacted, there'd be less competition, employment could decrease, and contracts would be further consolidated. So SBA proposed not to lower those 213 size standards, which would cut out about 7,900 businesses. But SBA asked for comments on that policy of not proposing to lower the size standards. I put a poll in my article as well asking the readers, should SBA maintain size standards at their current levels, or should SBA lower the size standards when data supports that they should not be lowered? And it's going about 50-50 right now. It looks like about half of the people think that SBA should keep the size standards where they are rather than lowering them. So let me go now to the history of SBA size standards. SBA actually started setting size standards in 1956. At that point, there was just one size standard for all of government contracting. It was 500 employees. There were other size standards for SBA's loan program. So I do find that interesting that SBA had a separate size standard for government contracting as compared to the loan and other assistance programs. But within government contracting, there was just one 500 employees. Now, as mentioned, there's 1,000 NAICS codes, so there's essentially 1,000 size standards. Some of them are the same, but that's really just happenstance that they are the same. The law now requires SBA to use data for every single size standard and calculate a specific size standard to that NAICS code. It used to be the case that SBA could consolidate similar NAICS industries into one size standard, but that's no longer the case under the laws that exist now. SBA also has to review those size standards every 5 years. The actual statute doesn't give SBA much direction on how to go about setting the size standards. Really, the only legal requirement is that a small business be one that's independently owned and operated, and which is not dominant in its field of operation. Otherwise, Congress told SBA, as long as you put a lot of the approach and the source of the data and the factors into the rule, into the proposed rule, SBA has a lot of discretion to come up with a methodology or process for how to evaluate the size standards. There is one important legal requirement that came about in 2019, which is that for manufacturing firms, SBA must use an employee-based size standard, and for services firms, SBA must use a revenue-based size standards. Remember, this proposed rule that came out a couple weeks ago is all revenue-based, so that includes all of the service industries. The size standards are most relevant for government contracting. They're less so relevant for loans and other SBA assistance, and that's primarily because within the loan programs, there's an alternative size standard. It's been around before 2010, but Congress really enacted a strict alternative size standard in 2010 during the financial crisis. And the alternative size standard is so high that most businesses fall below the alternative size standard. So it's really not relevant for 99% of businesses what the SBA NAICS code size standard is if they're applying for loans. Now, within the table that I put out on govconintelligence.com, you'll see that most of the major government contracting industries do not have a proposed change size standard. You can go to that table and you can sort by the dollars that go to each of the industries, and you'll see of the top 20 NAICS codes for small business dollars, those mean contracting dollars going to small business in 2024, the size standard would not change based on SBA's proposal. In fact, in many of those, SBA would have proposed a lower size standard based on the data, but because of that policy decision that I mentioned before, SBA decided not to lower the size standard and proposed to keep it where it is. There are 3 industries in the top 20 where SBA proposed to increase the size standard. The number 1 is engineering services, which is 541330. That would go from 25.5 million to 29 million. So that's a $3.5 million increase. The big consulting NAICS code, which is 541611, administrative management and general management consulting services, that would go from 24.5 to 27. So that's $2.5 million increase there. And then the NAICS code for security guards, which is 561612, it's security guards and patrol services, that would increase from 29 million to 34 million. That leaves a lot of the major government contracting industries untouched under this proposal. Those include 541519, that's computer-related services. Now, remember, there's a separate IT value-added reseller exception under 541519 with 150 employees. That would go in the second proposed rule on employee-based size standards, not in this one based on revenue. Other ones that would not increase under this proposal are 236220, that's commercial and institutional building construction, and 541512, which is computer systems design. Now, SBA mentioned that it's increasing 200 plus 259 size standards, but a lot of those increases are for industries where there's not a whole lot of government contracting activity. I actually went and looked at the delta between the proposed size standard and the current size standard, and the biggest increases are in industries like miscellaneous retailers, arcades, and marine fishing. Those are just not big government contracting industries. So when SBA is talking about increasing 259 size standards, it's really not 259 that are significant government contracting. A lot of them are in smaller industries or industries that have no government contracting activity at all. So as I was looking through the proposal and the questions that SBA asked number of questions as to whether SBA is correctly weighting the information that goes into the size standards. Those are data points such as the number of companies that exist in the industry, the average revenues that they have, as well as how they compete in government contracting. And I've gone through reading the comments on SBA size rules in the past, and what I tend to find in those comments is that most of the commenters want the size standards to be increased. They want higher size standards. And the reason is for this is when companies are growing, they don't want to grow in government contracting to the point where they exceed the size standard. That then puts you in competition with large businesses because you're no longer eligible for set-asides, but you're really not a huge business at that point. You've just graduated from being a small business, and that can lead to this valley of death where you're in the middle. You're not small enough to be small, but you're also not big enough to effectively compete with larger businesses. So businesses that are close to that situation tend to want higher size standards. And there's good reason on a broader government contracting perspective to look at increasing the size standards overall. One of those is that uh, companies that are nearing the size standard have what's called CSIS is called a perverse incentive to not grow anymore. They aren't expected to expand or increase their revenues, because if they do so, then they'll end up in that valley of death. And both the GAO and the Center for Strategic International Studies, CSIS, found that only about 6% of small businesses grow beyond small business status after 10 years. Congress has gotten involved in this type of discussion as well. In 2018, Congress passed the Small Business Runway Extension Act, which said that SBA needed to change the averaging period for size standards from 3 years to 5 years. So that would give firms a longer period of time to average their revenues so that they could continue to stay small. The problem with that 3 to 5 year average is if you have declining revenues, so if your amount of revenues is going down, it actually hurts you because you have large revenue years at the beginning that average out and actually increase your revenues as you get closer to that averaging period. So one thing that I proposed in my article is to take a look back at the way this situation looked in 1956 when SBA first proposed size standards, and think about doing an alternative size standard that applies to all industries. This would allow agencies that are awarding larger contracts. So the threshold would be probably the current size standard. So if you're looking at, say, a size standard industry with a size standard of $46 million, this would be a contract that's over $46 million. It would allow the agency to treat as a small business larger businesses that have actually exceeded that size standard. So in the article, I said could either be a multiple of the current size standard, maybe 2x or 3x, or a fixed amount, says 100 million. So what this would do is below the threshold, you would still keep the current size standards in place, and businesses would only qualify as small if they're under the SBA designated size standard. And that would leave those smaller contracts available for current small businesses, but it would allow businesses that have exceeded the size standard to be eligible for these larger contracts and still be able to compete as small without having to move over to the big category of large businesses. That's just a proposal I put out there. One thought I had is that something that would need to go through Congress in order to allow for the alternative size standard? That's what happened in the loan programs. Is it something that SBA could try out on their own, probably in consultation with Congress as they were doing this? And then how would businesses that are smaller, that would be competing against these mid-sized businesses, react to having this additional competition from firms that are no longer small businesses? So there would be a few issues and kinks to work out if SBA were to adopt that proposal. The SBA proposed rule on size standards is awaiting public comment. It was published on August 22nd, and comments are due October 21st. So you have 49 days from today to submit comments on that. There is a list of 12 questions in the proposed rule that SBA is seeking comment on. If you are interested in size standards, I would very much encourage you to take a look at those questions and submit through regulations.gov for SBA's review. Moving to some other issues that have come up in the past week, I also published an article about GSA's Polaris GWAC contract and what they're doing with SBA size and status protests. So I made the point there that small business status in the federal system is a peer policing system. The reason for that is SBA does not affirmatively certify businesses as small businesses. SBA does that for the 8A program, the Hub Zone program, the Women-Owned program, and the Veteran-Owned programs, but you can't apply to SBA to be considered a small business. Instead, what happens is when you sign up for SAM.gov, you self-certify your size in your sign up, and then essentially what happens is SAM.gov looks at all your NAICS codes and decides for each of those NAICS codes, are you over or under the size standard based on the information that you've self-certified. So there's no SBA approval of that self-certification. Instead, what happens is when you go out for a contract, your competitors can file protests against you or the other competitors at SBA, and SBA will then, based on that protest, determine whether or not the size that you self-certified is correct, or instead whether you might have falsely certified based on size and affiliation. That is the system that has existed since SBA began. It's always been this peer policing system. And so far, it's been effective to deter fraud because the competitors in contracting situations have a big incentive to file size protests in order to move up in the ranking and potentially win an award for an agency small business set aside or socioeconomic set aside. I noticed that when GSA published its list of Polaris awardees on Thursday, it published a Hub Zone list and a service-disabled veteran list. GSA said that this is just the first list of awardees. They were calling this a phased award approach. And the list said that if you're not on the list, quote, your proposal is still under consideration and you have not been eliminated from competition. Oh, that was really interesting to me because in the experience that I've had around SBA size protests, it appeared to me that GSA, whether it intended to or not, was creating difficulty in that peer policing system for competitors to file size protests. And the reason is that if you haven't been eliminated from competition, and with this phased approach, there's no firms at this point that have eliminated from competition, you don't really have a reason to consider filing a size protest. You have no reason to think that because a company that's on that list has got an award that you would somehow be pushed off of the award list. That's usually the situation where companies would file size protests, but the companies that are not on the list don't have the incentive to do that right now because they haven't been eliminated. And they may even think that if they file a size protest, it could hurt their chances of being selected in some of the future lists. And GSA could even make it nearly inconceivable that a company would file a size protest by waiting past the deadline for filing size protests of any of the winners before announcing who has not gotten an award. There's a 5 business day deadline for filing size protests. So if you, assuming there's no holidays or anything, if GSA announces on a Friday, then you can have until the next Friday to file size protests. Well, if GSA released the last list, and we don't necessarily know how many lists are going to be, but they've released the last list on a Friday and they wait 2 weeks to tell any firms that they've been eliminated, then those firms that have been eliminated are now too late to file any size protests with SBA. Now, I'm not certain that that's the reason that GSA is doing that. There's been some speculation about this. One of the reasons that GSA may be looking very carefully at SBA rules is Polaris, this GWAC, had been delayed for a year plus in 2023, 2024 timeframe because of litigation over separate SBA rules on the mentor-protege program. So GSA may be looking very carefully here on how can they eliminate and reduce any potential for delays because of mentor-protege, size protests, status protests, and other issues. I did get some feedback from readers after I published this article on Friday that this is especially significant for awardees that are joint ventures, because when a mentor-protege team or even multiple small businesses form a joint venture, there's no review by SBA in this case where there's competition. The only situation where joint ventures are reviewed is where there's a 8A sole source award. But in this case, which is not an 8A sole source contract, SBA would not review the joint venture agreements. The only situation where the joint venture agreements would be reviewed is if somebody files a size protest. And because GSA has structured the lists in this way, there's very little chance that any company is going to file a size protest. You're going to have a lot of joint venture agreements that maybe they've been reviewed by GSA, but they're certainly not going to go to SBA for any sort of second level review because of the lack of size protests. Also in this article, I mentioned that Senator Ed Markey sent a letter to SBA speculating that SBA's AI tool has flagged 85% of SBA's rules for removal or change. And I asked, is it really possible to cut SBA's rules by 85%? And in that part, I gave kind of tongue-in-cheek a proposal that SBA should just roll back all its regulations to when the programs first started, take out things that have developed over time, and add back in statutory requirements after that, that it could at least return SBA programs to its original purpose, and that wouldn't require AI to use. So we'll see what this AI comes out with, but at least it does flag that SBA is reviewing its rules, and there could be very significant cuts in those rules if SBA is relying on this AI tool that Senator Markey put out there. And then finally, one last note about the inflation adjustments that came out from both Department of Defense and the FAR Council last week. I had written an article, it was actually my first article for GovCon Intelligence, about how DoD had proposed to increase the authority for sole source contracting with entity-owned 8A firms from 100 million to 150 million. Remember, entity-owned firms are those that are owned by Alaska Native corporations, Indian tribes, and Native Hawaiian organizations. And the DoD proposed rule would have allowed Department of Defense to award 8A sole source contracts up to 150 million without a separate justification to those entity-owned firms. Well, the DoD final rule came out last week, and it did not include that 150 million authority. So essentially, the authority stays at 100 million, and it's basically because inflation in DoD's formula, quote, did not reach the statutory calculation formula for escalation, and that 150 million was removed. So I went into the background on exactly what happened there. Essentially, when DoD published the proposed rule on inflation adjustments, DoD predicted that inflation would be higher than it actually was. DoD used an inflation number of 321, and inflation ended up only at 320 for the date that DoD used, which was April. So it was really just a dollar difference. I think I actually calculated it was 43 cents difference in inflation between the situation where the threshold would go to 150 million and what it ended up, which is where it just stayed at 100 million. So it was very, very close to getting that threshold over to 150 million, but didn't quite make it there. So you can't count on these inflation adjustments always happening because it seems like these agencies, when they put out the inflation adjustments, they're predicting future inflation, and future inflation might not get to that level. And that had a couple of other effects in the inflation proposals as well. On the FAR acquisition rules, the FAR had proposed to increase the subcontracting plan threshold to $950,000. So this would mean that a large business contract that's below $950,000 would not require a subcontracting plan. That threshold actually only made it to $900,000 rather than $950,000. So that's going to be more large business contracts in the future that are required to have subcontracting plans. There was also a proposal to move all of the SBA program sole source thresholds for individual owned firms. So this is separate from the entity owned firms. Native Hawaiians are Native Hawaiian organizations are included in this for civilian agencies. The proposal would have increased all of those thresholds to $5.5 million, but the service-able vet program did not make it to $5.5 million. So the service-able vet-owned businesses will now have a sole source threshold of $5 million, but then it'll be 5.5 for 8A, hub zone, and women-owned small businesses. Some other big thresholds that are increasing are the micro purchase threshold that goes from 10,000 to 15,000, and the simplified acquisition threshold that goes from 250,000 to 350,000. Additionally, Alaska Native owned and Indian tribe owned firms will get higher sole source authority for civilian agencies in the 8A program. That authority goes from $25 million to $30 million. All of these increases are effective October 1. Just one note on that. There was an increase from $100 million to $150 million for the sole source approval by senior procurement executives within DoD, NASA, and Coast Guard contracts. And that's not the same threshold as what we were talking about before with the DoD 8A sole source threshold. There may be situations where 8A contracts fall between that 100 and 150 million. Those would still require, in the sole source context, an approval. It just wouldn't be the senior procurement executive approval in this. But for the most part, what I've seen is that the sole sources to entity-owned firms fall below that first threshold, which is now 100 million in DoD and then 30 million starting October 1 within civilian agency contracts. Well, this week I'm working on looking at what's going to happen when contracts consolidate with GSA, with the called function-based consolidation, where agencies are moving their procurement function over to GSA. I'm looking at some data there, and then there's a few bid protests that have come out that I'll analyze in the next edition of GovCon Intelligence. Well, thank you for reading. Thanks for watching my live stream, and I will see you later on this week with the next edition of GovCon Intelligence. Thanks very much.